Chapter 20 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20 The New Home in Lexington. Numerous guests, further sojourns at different baths, death of the General's brother, Smith Lee, visits to Ravensworth and the White House, meetings with interesting people at White Sulphur Springs, death of Professor Preston. On my father's return to Lexington, the new house was ready. It adjoined the one he had been occupying, so the distance was not great and the transfer was easily accomplished. It was much larger and more comfortable than the one given up. My mother's room was on the first floor and opened out on the veranda, extending three sides of the house, where she could be rolled in her chair. This she enjoyed intensely, for she was very fond of the open air, and one could see her there every bright day, with Mrs. Ruffner, a much petted cat, sitting on her shoulder or cradled in her lap. My father's favorite seat was in a deep window of the dining room, from which his eyes could rest on rolling hills of grass and grain, bounded by the ever-changing mountains. After his early and simple dinner, he usually took a nap of a few minutes, sitting upright in his chair, his hand held and rubbed by one of his daughters. There was a new stable, warm and sunny, for Traveller and his companion, Lucy Long, a cow-house, woodshed, garden, and yard, all planned, laid out, and built by my father. The increased room enabled him to invite a great number to visit him, and this summer the house was full. In answer to a letter from me on business which reached him during Commencement Week, he writes: "Lexington, Virginia, June 19, 1869. My dear son: I have just received your letter of the 10th and have only time for a word. I hope all things are going well with you both. With the improvements of your farm, proceeds will increase, and with experience, judgment, and economy will augment greatly. You will have to get married if you wish to prosper, and must therefore make arrangements to build your house this fall. If I live through this coming week, I wish to pay you and F a visit the week following, about July 1st. I am trying to persuade Custis to accompany me, but he has not yet responded. I am very much occupied with examinations, visitors, arrangements, etc. All are well and would send love if accessible. Mildred is full of housekeeping and dresses, and the house is full of young ladies, Mrs. Jones, Albert, Burwell, Fairfax, and Wickham, others in expectation. Good bye. Affectionately your father, R. E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, Jr. 10 days later he writes to his son Fitzhugh, giving up his proposed visit to him at this time, expressing his regrets at the necessity, and telling his reasons for so doing: "Lexington, Virginia, June 30, 1869. My dear Fitzhugh: This is the day that I had proposed to visit you, but I find it impossible to get away. I find a great deal to do in closing up the past session, and in preparing for the new. In addition, our college officers have all been changed — proctor, clerk, treasurer, librarian — and the new incumbents enter upon their duties to morrow. I shall have to be with them some days to initiate and install them. That would only delay me, but then on the 15th proximo the Educational Association of Virginia will meet here, and I should not be able to return in time. As I have never attended any of their meetings when elsewhere, if I were to go away when appointed here, it would look as if I wished to avoid them, which is not the case. After that is over, I must locate your poor mother at the baths, which she has made up her mind to visit, and prepare to go myself to the White Sulphur, the waters of which I want to drink for 3 or 4 weeks. So I do not see how I could get to the Pamunkey before the fall. I want to get there very much to see you all, and as far as my personal predilections are concerned, would rather go there than to the White, but the doctors think it would not be so beneficial to me, and I am obliged now to consider my health. I propose, therefore, that you bring Tab and the baby up to the mountains and leave them either at the baths with the Mim, or with me, if you cannot remain. Tell Rob, if he can, he must also come and see us. If he were here now, he would find very pleasant company, Mrs. Jones, Albert, Kirkland, Burwell, Fairfax, and Wickham, all in the house, with others out of it. They are so much engaged with the collegiates that Custis and I see but little of them, but he could compete with the yearlings, which we cannot. Tell my daughter Tab her father is here, very well, and dined with us yesterday. Give my much love to grandson. He must not forget me. I have a puppy and a kitten for him to play with. All send love. Truly your father, R. E. Lee. General William H. Fitzhugh Lee. In a letter dated Lexington, Virginia, July 9th, he gives a further account of his plans for the summer. I have delivered your letter to Mildred, who has just returned from a visit to the University of Virginia, where she saw a great many persons and met with a great deal of pleasure. She ought to be, and I believe is, satisfied with commencements for this year, having participated in 3. I am sorry to tell you that I cannot go down to the Pamunkey this summer as I had intended. I had hoped to be able, after the conclusion of the commencement exercises of Washington College, to visit the Pamunkey and to return by the 15th instant, so as to be present at the convention of the Teachers of Virginia, which assembles here on that day. But I was detained here so long that I found I would be unable to accomplish what I desired. Custis, who was to have accompanied me, will go down in a day or 2. About the 20th of this month I shall go to the Rockbridge Baths with Mrs. Lee, who wishes to try the waters again, and after seeing her comfortably located, if nothing prevents, I shall go with Mildred and Agnes to the White Sulphur for a few weeks. It is delightfully quiet here now. Both institutions have closed, and all are off enjoying their holiday. I should like to remain if I could. Colonel Shipp and Harding have gone to get married, report says. Colonel Lyle and Captain Henderson, it is said, will not return. Captain Preston having been appointed professor at William and Mary, we shall necessarily lose him, but Colonel Allen will be back, and all the rest. We are as well as you left us. The girls had several of their friends at commencement. All have departed except Miss Fairfax and Miss Wickham. The election is over, and the town is tranquil. The quiet and rest which he so much desired, and which he was enjoying when he wrote, did not long remain his. He had just gotten my mother comfortably settled at the Baths when he received the news of the sudden death of his brother Smith. He went at once to Alexandria, hoping to be in time for the burial. From there he writes my mother. Alexandria, July 25, 1869. My Dear Mary: I arrived here last evening, too late to attend the burial of my dear brother, an account of which I have clipped from the Alexandria Gazette and inclosed to you. I wish you would preserve it. Fitz and Mary went up to Ravensworth the evening of the funeral services, Friday 23rd, so that I have not seen them, but my nephew Smith is here, and from him I have learned all particulars. The attack of his father was short, and his death apparently unexpected until a short time before it occurred. Mary General Lee's eldest daughter, was present, and I hope of some comfort to her uncle and assistance to her aunt. Fitz came here the afternoon of his father's death, Thursday the 22nd, made all arrangements for the funeral, went out to Ravensworth to announce the intelligence to our aunt. He carried down Friday morning on the steamer Mrs. Cooper and Jenny to stay with his mother, and returned that afternoon with his father's remains, which were committed to earth as you will see described. John returned the next morning, yesterday, in the mail boat, to his mother, with whom Dan stayed. Robert arrived this morning, and has gone to Ravensworth to announce my arrival. I shall remain here until I see or hear from Fitz, for, as you will see by the Gazette account, the last resting place of the body has not been determined upon. Fitz, I understand, wishes it interred at Hollywood, Richmond, Nannie at the cemetery here, where her father, mother, and daughter are buried, and Mrs. Fitzhugh at Ravensworth. I think Nannie's wishes should be consulted. I shall probably leave to-day or to-morrow, and after seeing all that remains to us of our dear brother deposited in its last earthly home, and mingling my sorrow for a brief season with that of his dear wife and children, I shall return to you. Please send this letter after perusal to Agnes and Mildred, as I shall be unable to write to them. I am staying at the Mansion House. Our Aunt Maria did not come down to the funeral services, prevented, I fear, by her rheumatic attack. May God bless us all and preserve us for the time when we too must part, the one from the other, which is now close at hand, and may we all meet again at the footstool of our merciful God, to be joined by his eternal love, never more to separate. Most truly and affectionately, R. E. Lee. Mrs. M. C. Lee. The loss of his brother was a great sorrow to him. They were devoted to each other, having always kept warm their boyish love. Smith's admiration for and trust in my father were unbounded, and it was delightful to see them together and listen to the stories of the happy long ago they would tell about each other. No one could be near my Uncle Smith without feeling his joyful influence. My sister Mary, who knew him long and well, and who was much attached to him, thus writes: "No one who ever saw him can forget his beautiful face, charming personality, and grace of manner, which, joined to a nobility of character and goodness of heart, attracted all who came in contact with him, and made him the most generally beloved and popular of men. This was especially so with women, to whom his conduct was that of a preux chevalier, the most chivalric and courteous; and having no daughters of his own, he turned with the tenderest affection to the daughters of his brother Robert." After all the arrangements connected with this sad event had been completed, my father went up to Ravensworth to see Aunt Maria, who had always been a second mother to his brother. There, amid the cool shades of this lovely old home, he rested for a day or two from the fatigues of travel and the intense heat. During this visit, as he passed the room in which his mother had died, he lingered near the door and said to one present: "40 years ago I stood in this room by my mother's death bed. It seems now but yesterday." While here he determined to go back to Lexington via Richmond, and to run down thence to the White House to see his grandson. He arrived there on Friday, July 30th. On Sunday he wrote to my mother: "White House, New Kent, August 1st, 1869. "My Dear Mary: I arrived here on Friday last, and found them all well. Our daughter Tab has not been altogether well, and shows its effects. Her baby, I think, would also be improved by mountain air. I have therefore persuaded her to accompany me and join you at the Baths. We shall leave Richmond, if nothing prevents, on Tuesday morning, 3d inst., and hope to reach the Baths that evening in the stage from Goshen. I have written to Mr. Peyton, requesting him to prepare a good room for Tab and her little family, as near you as convenient, and trust we may reach there in health and comfort at the time appointed. I hope I shall find you well and comfortable, and Markie in the enjoyment of every good. How are the poor little children? My previous letters will have informed you of everything important. I will supply all omissions when I see you. Custis is here, much improved. I have not yet seen Rob. Farmers here are threshing out their wheat, which occupies them closely. Fitzhugh's is turning out well, and he hopes to gather a fair crop. Robert came up last Wednesday with his friend, Mr. Dallam, and went down Thursday. He was very well. Custis arrived Saturday week. Mr. Kepler is here, and will preach at St. Peter's this morning. I hope to attend. Mr. Kepler says his health is much improved. Fitzhugh doses him with Coelho. Goodbye. Affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. St. Peter's was the old colonial church a few miles away, in which General Washington and Mrs. Custis were married about 100 years prior to this time. Mr. Kepler, the pastor, preached there twice a month. He lived in Richmond, and to keep him free from fever and ague, my brother dosed him freely with Coelho whenever he came down into the malarial country. I came up from Romancoke Sunday morning, arriving in time to be present at the christening of my nephew, which ceremony was decided on rather hurriedly in order that the grandfather might stand as godfather. After returning from the morning service at St. Peter's, where we all went, it was decided that the mother and child should go to the mountains with my father. As there were some preparations for the summer to be made, his daughter and her baby went to Petersburg that afternoon, agreeing to meet the General in Richmond Monday night and start for the Rockbridge Baths Tuesday morning. On Monday he writes to a friend with whom he had intended to stop for a day on his way back to Lexington: "White House, New Kent County, August 1st, 1869. I had promised myself the pleasure of seeing you on my way to Lexington, of spending with you one short day to cheer and refresh me, but I shall travel up in a capacity that I have not undertaken for many years, as escort to a young mother and her infant, and it will require the concentration of all my faculties to perform my duties even with tolerable comfort to my charge. I go up with my daughter, I may say this time, too, my youngest daughter, his daughter-in-law, Mrs. W. H. F. Lee, to place her with her mamma at the Rockbridge Baths, the waters of which I hope will invigorate both mother and child, who have been wearied and weakened by the long attack of whooping cough from which the latter has suffered. I came down from Richmond to spend Sunday, and was fortunate enough to find here my 3 sons, but I am sorry to say but one daughter. Most truly yours, R. E. Lee. Monday night was spent in Richmond. It was soon known that General Lee was at the Exchange Hotel, and great numbers came to call upon him, so that he was compelled to hold an informal reception in the large parlors. The next day, with his new daughter and her baby, he started for the Baths, where they arrived safely the same night. Then he proceeded to carry out his original plan for the summer, and went with his 2 daughters to the White Sulphur Springs. From there he writes to his wife: "White Sulphur Springs, Greenbrier County, West Virginia, August 10, 1869. My Dear Mary: I received this morning your addenda to Annie Wickham's letter enclosing Custis's. I also received by same mail a letter from Mr. Richardson, reiterating his request to insert my portrait in my father's memoirs, saying that it was by the desire of many mutual friends, on the ground of its giving additional interest to the work and increasing its sale. That may or may not be so. At any rate, I differ from them. Besides, there is no good portrait accessible to him, and the engraving in the Lee family, I think, would be an injury to any book. His recent proposition of inserting my portrait where the family history is given takes from it a part of my obligation, and if it were believed that such an addition would add to the interest of the book, I should assent. I have so told him, and that I would write to you for your suggestions, and to ask whether you could send him a portrait worth inserting. What do you think? There is to be a grand concert here to night for the benefit of our church at Lexington. It is gotten up by Miss Mary Jones and other kind people here, and the proposition is so favourably received that I hope a handsome sum will be realized. The girls are well. I do not know how long they will continue so. They seem to be foot-free. A great many visitors were turned off last night. No room for them. A grand ball in honour of Mr. Peabody is to come off to-morrow, after which it is supposed there will be more breathing space. I have seen Mr. and Mrs. Charles Ridgely of Hampton since I wrote, also numerous other acquaintances. I should prefer more quiet. How is my daughter Tab? Mother and son are improving, I trust. I hope you and Markie are also doing well. No change in myself as yet. The girls would send love if I could find them. Affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. Mrs. R. E. Lee. A few days later he writes: White Sulphur Springs, August 14, 1869. My Dear Mary: I received last night your letter of the 13th, very prompt delivery, and I am very glad to learn of the well-doing of all of you. I am particularly pleased to hear that our daughter and grandson are improving, and should you find them not benefiting, I wish you would urge them to try some other springs, for I have it greatly to heart that they would receive all possible advantage from their summer trip. I hope Markie will be benefited by the Red Sweet. The water is considered a great tonic, but I fear none will be warm enough for her but the hot. If I cannot get over to see her, I will notify her of our departure from here, which will be in about 2 weeks. I have received a letter from Fitz Lee, saying that Mary would leave Richlands last Tuesday, 10th instant, for Ravensworth, which I presume she did, as his letter was postmarked that day at Accout Creek, and was probably mailed by him or one of the boys on putting her aboard the mail boat. You will be glad to learn that the proceeds of the concert for our church at Lexington netted $605, which has been subsequently increased to $805 by Messrs. Corcoran and Peabody, with a donation of $100 from each. For all of this I am extremely grateful. As regards the portrait for Mr. Richardson, you must do as you please. I shall not write to him any more on the subject. Unless the portrait is good and pleasing, I think it will be an injury to the book. I have had a visit since commencing this letter from a Mrs. William Bath, of New Orleans, who showed me a wreath made in part, she says, of my, your, and Mildred's hair, sent her by you more than 2 years ago. She says she sent you a similar one at the time, but of this I could tell her nothing, for I recollect nothing about it. She says her necessities now compel her to put her wreath up to raffle, and she desired to know whether I had any objection to her scheme, and whether I would head the list. All this, as you may imagine, is extremely agreeable to me, but I had to decline her offer of taking a chance in her raffle. Miss Mary Jones has gone to the suite. Tell Miss Bell I wish she were coming here. I shall be glad to see Mrs. Caskey. Mildred has her picture. The girls are always busy at something, but never ready. The Stewarts have arrived. Mrs. Julia is improving very perceptibly. Love to all. R. E. Lee. The Marquis referred to in each of the above letters was Martha Custis Williams, a great niece of my grandfather, Mr. Custis, who had for many years lived at Arlington with her uncle. The little children were her motherless nieces, whom she had brought that summer to the mountains for their health. General Lee had been engaged for some time in bringing out a 3rd edition of his father's Memoirs of the War of '76 in the Southern States. It was now in the hands of his publisher, Mr. Richardson, of New York. To this edition he had added a sketch of the famous Light Horse Harry, written by himself. It was to his publisher's proposition of placing his portrait in the introduction to the new work that he at first objected, and then agreed, as stated in the 2 letters just given. The season of '69 is still noted in the annals of the White Sulphur as having had in its unusually large company so many noted and distinguished men. Mr. George Peabody and Mr. W. W. Corcoran, the 2 great philanthropists, were among them, and helped to enlarge the receipts of the concert for the benefit of the little Episcopal church in Lexington, of which General Lee was a member and a vestryman. By the last of August he was back again in Lexington, making arrangements for the homecoming of his wife and her party from the Baths. Here is part of another letter written soon after his arrival home, some lines of which, apparently relating to the servants, have been partially obliterated by time. Lexington, Virginia, August 31, 1869. My dear Mary, I received this evening your note by Miss Mays. You had better come up whenever agreeable to your party. We can only try them and make the best of them. Alice, when she gets well, will return, if wanted. If Cousin Julia, Mrs. Richard Stewart of Cedar Grove, will return with you, you can see her here as well as there, and we can all have that pleasure. If she will not, you had better remain with her as long as she will stay. Mrs. Pratt died to-day at 12:30 p.m. I received a letter to-day from Edward Childe, saying that he and Blanche would leave Liverpool in the Java on September 4th, and after spending a few days in the North, would come to Lexington. He will probably reach Boston about September 15th, so that they may be expected here from the 20th to the 30th of September. I am anxious for them to see our daughter and grandson and all our sons. Give my best love to all with you. The girls would send love, but a yearling and a leader of the herd occupy them. Yearling was a term that originated with us just after the war, when many of the students were ex-soldiers, to distinguish the real boys from the Confeds. From that expression a professor came to be called a leader of the herd. It was a form of speech that we had kept up amongst ourselves. Affectionately yours, R. E. Lee. Mrs. M. C. Lee. This session of Washington College opened with very favorable prospects. The number of students was larger than ever before, every Southern and some Northern States being represented. The new chairs of instruction which had been instituted were now in good working order, their professors were comfortably established, and the entire machinery of the institution was running well and smoothly. The President commenced to see some of the results of his untiring energy and steady work. He had many plans which lack of funds prevented him from carrying out. One of them was a school of commerce, in which a student, while following the branches which would discipline and cultivate the mind, might also receive special instruction and systematic training in whatever pertained to business in the largest sense of the term. Another was a school of medicine, the plan for which, with full details, was drawn up under his eye, and kept in readiness until the funds of the institution should permit of its being carried into effect. His meeting with Mr. Peabody at the White Sulphur Springs attracted that gentleman's attention to the college and to his work as its president. To a request for his photograph to be placed in the Peabody Institute among the friends of its founder, he sends with the likeness the following note: Washington College, Virginia, September 25, 1869. F. Poole, Secretary, Peabody Institute, Peabody, Massachusetts. Dear Sir: In compliance with your request, I am sending a photograph of myself, the last that has been taken, and shall feel honored in its being placed among the friends of Mr. Peabody's, for though they can be numbered by millions, yet all can appreciate the man who has illustrated his age by his munificent charities during his life, and by his wise provisions for promoting the happiness of his fellow creatures. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee. My father's family was now comfortably established in their new home, and had the usual number of friends visiting them this autumn. In due time Edward Childe, Blanche, and Ducky, their little dog, arrived, and remained a week or two. The last named member of the party was of great interest. He was very minute, very helpless, and received more attention than the average baby. He had crossed the Atlantic in fear and trembling, and did not apparently enjoy the new world. His utter helplessness, and the great care taken of him by his mistress, his ill health, and the unutterable woe of his countenance, greatly excited my father's pity. After he went away, he often spoke of him, and referred to him, I find, in one of his letters. During this trip to America, Edward and his wife, carrying the wretched Ducky with them, paid their visit to the White House. This autumn the little carriage my father mentioned having purchased for my mother in Baltimore was put into use. He frequently drove out in it with my mother, his new daughter, and grandson. Lucy Long, under his guidance, carefully carried them over the beautiful hills around Lexington. One afternoon, while paying a visit with his daughter Tab to Colonel William Preston Johnston, who lived 2 miles down the river, in pulling up a steep ascent to the front door, Lucy fell, choked into unconsciousness by too tight a collar. My father jumped out, hastily got off the harness, and on perceiving the cause of the accident, reproached himself vehemently for his carelessness and thoughtlessness. He was very much distressed at this accident, petted his mare, saying to her in soothing tones that he was ashamed of himself for having caused her all this pain after she had been so faithful to him. His rides on Traveller, in which he delighted so much, were not so frequent now. He was not so strong as he had been through the spring and summer, and indeed during November he had a very severe attack of cold, from which he did not recover for several weeks. However, during the beautiful days of October he was often seen out in the afternoons on his old gray. His favorite route was the road leading to the Rockbridge Baths. A year previous to this time he would sometimes go as far as the Baths and return in an afternoon, a trip of 20 miles. A part of this road led through a dense forest. One afternoon, as he told the story himself, he met a plain old soldier in the midst of these woods, who, recognizing the general, reined in his horse and said, "General Lee, I am powerful glad to see you, and I feel like cheering you." The general replied that this would not do, as they were all alone, only 2 of them, and there would be no object whatever in cheering. But the old soldier insisted that he must, and waving his hat about his head, cried out, "Hurrah for General Lee!" and kept repeating it. As the general rode away, he continued to hear the cheers until he was out of sight. On another afternoon, as Professors White and Nelson, taking a horseback ride, approached the summit of a long hill, they heard behind them the sound of a horse's feet running rapidly. In a few moments General Lee appeared on Traveller at full speed. On joining his friends, he reined up and said, "I thought a little run would be good for Traveller." He often gave his horse a breather, as he called it. The animal was so strong and powerful that he chafed at restraint, and, unless ridden regularly and hard, had a very disagreeable, fretful trot. After a good gallop up one of the long Rockbridge hills, he would proceed at a quiet walk. The tenderness in my father's heart for children I have already often remarked upon. One afternoon 2 little girls, the daughters of 2 of his professors, were riding on a gentle old horse up and down one of the back streets of the town, fearing to go far from home. The General, starting out on his afternoon ride, came up with them, and, knowing them well, said gaily, "Come with me, little girls, and I will show you a beautiful ride." Only too delighted, they consented to go. He took them out beyond the fair grounds, from which point there is one of the grandest stretches of mountain scenery in the world. One of the little maidens had her face tied up, as she was just recovering from the mumps. He pretended that he was much alarmed lest his horse should catch them from her, and kept saying, "I hope you won't give Traveller the mumps," and "What shall I do if Traveller gets the mumps?" An hour later this party was seen returning, the 2 little girls in sunbonnets on the one old sleepy horse, and General Lee by their side on Traveller, who was stepping very proudly, as if in scorn of his lowly companion. My father took the children to their homes, helped them to dismount, took a kiss from each, and, waving a parting salute, rode away. It was such simple acts of kindness and consideration that made all children confide in him and love him. Soon after the attack of cold mentioned above, he writes to his son Fitzhugh, then at the White House with his family: "Lexington, Virginia, December 2, 1869. My dear Fitzhugh: Your letters to Custis told us of your well doing. I want to see you all very much, and think the sight of my daughter and grandson would do me good. I have had a wretched cold, the effects of which have not left me, but I am better. The doctors still have me in hand, but I fear can do no good. The present mild weather, I hope, will be beneficial, enabling me to ride and be in the open air. But Traveller's trot is harder to me than it used to be, and fatigues me. We are all as usual, the women of the family very fierce, and the men very mild. Custis has been a little unwell, but is well regulated by his sisters. Neither gaiety nor extravagance prevails amongst us, and the town is quiet. Our community has been greatly grieved at the death of Mr. Frank Preston, to whom I was much attached, and for whom I had a high esteem. Give my love to Bertus. Tell him I hope Mrs. Taylor will retain one of her little daughters for him. She always reserves the youngest of the flock for Custis, as he is not particular as to an early date. Your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. General William H. F. Lee. Frank Preston, at the time of his death, was professor of Greek at William and Mary College. He had been, prior to his appointment to that position, an assistant professor at Washington College. He was a native of Lexington, a son of Colonel Thomas L. Preston, who was for so long a time professor at the Virginia Military Institute. A brilliant scholar, trained in the best German universities, and a gentleman in the highest sense of the word, Frank had served his state in the late war, and had left an arm on the heights of Winchester. On hearing of his death, President Lee issued the following announcement: Washington College, November 23, 1869. The death of Professor Frank Preston, a distinguished graduate and late associate professor of Greek in this college, has caused the deepest sorrow in the hearts of the institution. Endowed with a mind of rare capacity, which had been enriched by diligent study and careful cultivation, he stood among the first in the State in his pursuit in life. We who so long and so intimately possessed his acquaintance, and so fully enjoyed the privilege of his companionship, feel especially his loss and grieve profoundly at his death, and we heartily sympathize with his parents and relations in their great affliction, and truly participate in the deep sorrow that has befallen them. with the view of testifying the esteem felt for his character and the respect due to his memory, all academic exercises will be suspended for the day, and the faculty and students are requested to attend in their respective bodies his funeral services at the Presbyterian Church at 11 o'clock, to pay the last sad tribute of respect to his earthly remains, while cherishing in their hearts his many virtues. R. E. Lee, President. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Failing Health. The General declines lucrative positions in New York and Atlanta. He suffers from an obstinate cold. Local gossip. He is advised to go South in the spring of 1870. Desires to visit his daughter Annie's grave. After General Lee had accepted the presidency of Washington College, he determined to devote himself entirely to the interest and improvement of that institution. From this resolution he never wavered. An offer that he should be at the head of a large house to represent Southern commerce, that he should reside in New York, and have placed at his disposal an immense sum of money, he declined, saying, "I am grateful, but I have a self-imposed task which I must accomplish. I have led the young men of the South in battle. I have seen many of them die on the field. I shall devote my remaining energies to training young men to do their duty in life." To a request from some of his old officers that he should associate himself with a business enterprise in the South as its president, he replied with the following letter: Lexington, Virginia, December 14, 1869. General J. B. Gordon, President, Southern Life Insurance Company, Atlanta, Georgia. My dear General: I have received your letter of the 3d instant, and am duly sensible of the kind feelings which prompted your proposal. It would be a great pleasure to me to be associated with you, Hampton, B. H. Hill, and the other good men whose names I see on your list of directors. But I feel that I ought not to abandon the position I hold at Washington College at this time, or as long as I can be of service to it. Thanking you for your kind consideration, for which I know I am alone indebted for your proposition to become president of the Southern Life Insurance Company, and with kindest regards to Mrs. Gordon and my best wishes for yourself, I am very truly yours, R. E. Lee. His correspondence shows that many like propositions were made to him. The Christmas of '69 neither my brother nor myself was with him. Knowing of our plans in that respect, he wrote before the holidays to Fitzhugh, wishing us both the compliments of the season and a pleasant time in the visits we were going to make. Lexington, Virginia, December 18, 1869. My dear Fitzhugh: I must begin by wishing you a pleasant Christmas and many, many Happy New Years, and may each succeeding year bring to you and yours increasing happiness. I shall think of you and my daughter and my grandson very often during the season when families are generally united, and though absent from you in person, you will always be present in my mind, and my poor prayers and best wishes will accompany you all wherever you are. Bertus will also be remembered, and I hope that the festivities of Brandon will not drive from his memory the homely board at Lexington. I wish that he will enjoy himself and find some one to fill that void in his heart as completely as he will the one in his system. Tell Tab that no one in Petersburg wants to see her half as much as her papa, and now that her little boy has his mouth full of teeth, he would not appear so lonesome as he did in the summer. If she should find in the burg a ducky to take his place, I beg that she will send him up to me. I duly received your letter previous to the 12th instant, and requested some of the family who were writing about that time to inform you. What I last wrote, I could not find it on my table and did not refer to it. The Mim says you excel her in counting, if you do not in writing, but she does not think she is in your debt. I agree with you in your views about Smith's Island, and see no advantage in leasing it, but wish you could sell it to advantage. I hope the prospects may be better in the spring. Political affairs will be better, I think, and people will be more sanguine and hopeful. You must be on the alert. I wish I could go down to see you, but think it better for me to remain here. To leave home now and return during the winter would be worse for me. It is too cold for your mother to travel now. She says she will go down in the spring, but you know what an exertion it is for her to leave home, and the inconvenience, if not the suffering, is great. The anticipation, however, is pleasing to her, and encourages hope, and I like her to enjoy it, though am not sanguine that she will realize it. Mildred is probably with you, and can tell you all about us. I am somewhat reconciled to her absence by the knowledge of the benefit that she will be to Tab. Tell the latter that she, Mildred, is modest and backward in giving advice, but that she has mines of wealth on that subject, and that she, Tab, must endeavour to extract from her her views on the management of a household, children, etc., and the proper conduct to be observed toward husbands and the world in general. I am sure my little son will receive many wise admonitions which he will take open-mouthed. I have received a letter from your Uncle Carter, telling me of his pleasant visit to you and of his agreeable impressions of his nephew and new niece. He was taken very sick in Richmond, and delayed there so long that he could not be present at William Kennon's wedding, and missed the festivities at his neighbour Gillian's and at Norwood. Indeed, he had not recovered his strength when Lucy wrote a few days ago, and her account makes me very uneasy about him. I am glad Rob has so agreeable a neighbour as General Cooke, and I presume it is the North Carolina Brigadier. A Virginian, son of General St. George Cooke of the Federal Army, who commanded a North Carolina brigade in A. P. Hill's corps, A.N., Virginia. When you go to Petersburg, present my kind regards to Mr. and Mrs. Bowling, Miss Melville, and all friends. All here unite with me in love to you, Tab, and the boy, in which Mildred is included. Your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. General William H. F. Lee. In a note written the day after, acknowledging a paper sent to him to sign, he says, I wrote to you yesterday, Saturday, in reply to your former letter, and stated the reasons why I could not visit you. Your mother has received Mildred's letter announcing her arrival in Richmond, and will write to her there. I can only repeat my love and prayers that every blessing may attend you and yours. We are, as usual, truly and affectionately, R. E. Lee. General William H. F. Lee. The attack of cold from which my father suffered in October had been very severe. Rapid exercise on horseback or on foot produced pain and difficulty in breathing. After he was considered by most of his friends to have gotten well over it, it was very evident to his doctors and himself that there was a serious trouble about the heart, and he often had great weariness and depression. He complained but little, was often very bright and cheerful, and still kept up his old-time fun and humour in his conversation and letters, but his letters written during this year to his immediate family show that he was constantly in pain, and had begun to look upon himself as an invalid. To Mildred, who was in Richmond on a visit to friends, he writes jokingly about the difficulty experienced by the family in finding out what she meant in a letter to him. Lexington, Virginia, January 8, 1870. My precious life. I received your letter of the 4th. We held a family council over it. It was passed from eager hand to hand, and attracted wondering eyes and mysterious looks. It produced few words, but a deal of thinking, and the conclusion arrived at, I believe unanimously, was that there was a great fund of amusement and information in it if it could be extracted. I have therefore determined to put it carefully away till your return, seize a leisure day, and get you to interpret it. Your mother's commentary, in a suppressed soliloquy, was that you had succeeded in writing a wretched hand. Agnes thought that it would keep this cold weather, her thoughts running on jellies and oysters in the storeroom. But I, indignant at such aspersions upon your accomplishments, retained your epistle, and read in an elevated tone an interesting narrative of travels in sundry countries, describing gorgeous scenery, hairbreadth escapes, and a series of remarkable events by flood and field, not a word of which they declared was in your letter. Your return, I hope, will prove the correctness of my version of your annals. I have little to tell. Gaiety continues. Last night there was a cadet hop. Night before, a party at Colonel Johnston's. The night preceding, a college conversazione at your mother's. It was given in honour of Miss Maggie Johnston's visit of a few days to us. You know how agreeable I am on such occasions, but on this I am told I surpassed myself. On New Year's Day, the usual receptions. Many of our friends called, many of my ancients as well as juniors were present, and all enjoyed some good Norfolk oysters. I refer you to Agnes for details. We are pretty well. I think I am better. Your mother and sisters as usual. Custis busy with the examination of the cadets, the students preparing for theirs. Cadet Cook, who was so dangerously injured by a fall from his window on the 1st, it is hoped now will recover. The Misses Pendleton were to have arrived this morning, and Miss Ella Henenberger is on a visit to Miss Campbell. Miss Lizzie Letcher still absent. Messrs. Anderson, Baker, W. Graves, Moorman, Strickler, and Webb have all been on visits to their sweethearts and have left without them. Mrs. Smith is as usual. Gus is as wild as ever. Footnote: Mrs. Smith and Gus were the names of two of the pet cats of my sister. Gus was short for Gustavus Adolphus. End note. We catch our own rats and mice now, and are independent of cats. All unite in love to you, your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. A month later he writes again to his daughter in the same playful strain, and sends his remembrance to many friends in Richmond. Lexington, Virginia, February 2, 1870. My precious life. Your letter of the 29th ultimo, which has been 4 days on the road, reached me this morning, and my reply, unless our mails whip up, will not get to you before Sunday or Monday. There is no danger, therefore, of our correspondence becoming too brisk. What do the young girls do whose lovers are at Washington College or the Institute? Their tender hearts must always be in a lacerated and bleeding condition. I hope you are not now in that category, for I see no pining swains among them whose thoughts and wishes are stretching eagerly toward Richmond. I am glad you have had so pleasant a visit to the Andersons. You must present my regards to them all, and I hope that Mrs. Allen and Mary will come to see you in the summer. I am sure you will have an agreeable time at Brook Hill. Remember me to all the family, and tell Miss Bell to spare my friend Wilkins. He is not in a condition to enjoy the sufferings which she imposes on her Richmond beaux. Besides, his position entitles him to tender treatment. I think it time that you should be thinking of returning home. I want to see you very much, and as you have been receiving instruction from the learned pig, I shall expect to see you much improved. We are not reduced to apply to such instructors at Lexington. Here we have learned professors to teach us what we wish to know, and the Franklin Institute to furnish us lectures on science and literature. You had better come back if you are in search of information on any subject. I am glad that Miss Nannie Wise found one occasion on which her ready tongue failed her. She will have to hold it in subjection now. I should like to see Miss Bell under similar circumstances, provided she did not die from suppressed ideas. What an awful feeling she must experience if the occasion should ever come to her to restrain that active member. Although my friend Wilkins would be very indulgent, I think he would want her to listen sometimes. Miss Pendleton has just been over to give us some pleasing news. Her niece, Miss Susan Meade, Philip's daughter, is to be married next month to a Mr. Brown of Kentucky, who visited her 2 years ago upon the recommendation of the Reverend Charles Page, found her a schoolgirl, and has waited until she became a woman. He is rich, 49, and has 6 children. There is a fair start in the world for a young woman. I recommend her example to you. We are all as usual, and Mrs. Smith is just the same. Miss Maggie Johnston, who has been staying with us occasionally for a few days at a time, is now on a visit to us. There is to be an anniversary celebration of the societies of the Institute on Friday, and a students' party on Monday night, and a dance at the College Hotel. Tomorrow night your mother has an evening for some young students. Gaiety will never cease in Lexington so long as the ladies are so attractive and the men so agreeable. Surprise parties are the fashion now. Miss Lucy Campbell has her cousin, Miss Ella Henenberger, staying with her, who assists her to surprise and capture 2 unwary youths. I am sorry to hear of Mrs. Oole's illness. If you see her, present me most kindly to her. Also to Mrs. George Randolph. Do beware of vanilla cream. Recollect how far you are from home, and do not tamper with yourself. Our semi-annual examination has been in progress for a fortnight. We shall conclude on Saturday, which will be a great relief to me, for in addition to other things, I have to be 6 hours daily in the examination rooms. I was sorry that I could not attend Mr. Peabody's funeral, but I did not feel able to undertake the journey, especially at this season. I am getting better, I hope, and feel stronger than I did, but I cannot walk much farther than to the college, though when I get on my horse I can ride with comfort. Agnes accompanies me very often. I must refer you to her and your mother for all local news. Give my love to Fitzhugh and Tab and Robert when you see them, and for yourself keep an abundance. I have received letters from Edward and Blanche. They are very anxious about the condition of political affairs in France. Blanche sent you some receipts for creams, etc. You had better come and try them. Your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. The following letter to his son Fitzhugh further shows his tender interest in his children and grandson. Lexington, Virginia, February 14, 1870. My dear Fitzhugh, I hope that you are all well, and that you will not let any one spoil my grandson. Your mother has written all the family and Lexington news. She gathers much more than I do. I go nowhere but to the college, and when the weather permits I ride in the mountains. I am better, I think, but still troubled. Mildred, I hope, is with you. When she gets away from her papa, she does not know what she wants to do. Tell her. You have had a fine winter for work, and later you will have a profitable season. Custis is well and very retired. I see no alarming exhibition of attention to the ladies. I have great hopes of Robert. Give much love to my daughter Tab and to poor little Life. I wish I could see you all. It would do my pains good. Poor little Agnes is not at all well, and I am urging her to go away for a while. Mary, as usual. Affectionately your father, R. E. Lee. General W. H. F. Lee. After waiting all winter for the improvement in his health, my father, yielding at last to the wishes of his family, physician, and friends, determined to try the effect of a Southern climate. It was thought it might do him good, at any rate, to escape the rigors of a Lexington march, and could do no harm. In the following letters to his children he outlines his plans, and touchingly alludes to the memory of his daughter Annie, who died in 1862 and was buried at Warrenton Springs, North Carolina. Lexington, Virginia, March 21, 1870. My dear daughter, the doctors and others think I had better go to the South, in the hope of relieving the effects of the cold under which I have been laboring all the winter. I think I should do better here, and am very reluctant to leave home in my present condition, but they seem so interested in my recovery and so persuasive in their uneasiness that I should appear obstinate, if not perverse, if I resisted longer. I therefore consented to go, and will take Agnes to Savannah, as she seems anxious to visit that city, or perhaps she will take me. I wish also to visit my dear Annie's grave before I die. I have always desired to do so since the cessation of active hostilities, but have never been able. I wish to see how calmly she sleeps away from us all, with her dear hands folded over her breast, as if in mute prayer, while her pure spirit is traversing the land of the blessed. I shall diverge from the main route of travel for this purpose, and it will depend somewhat upon my feelings and somewhat upon my procuring an escort for Agnes, whether I go further south. I am sorry not to be able to see you before I go, but if I return I hope to find you here well and happy. You must take good care of your mother and do everything she wants. You must not shorten your trip on account of our departure. Custis will be with her every day, and Mary is with her still. The servants seem attentive. Goodbye, my dear child. Remember me to all friends, and believe me, your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. Lexington, Virginia, March 22, 1870. My dear Fitzhugh: Your letter of the 17th instant has been received. Lest I should appear obstinate, if not perverse, I have yielded to the kind importunities of my physicians and of the faculty to take a trip toward the South. In pursuance of my resolution, I shall leave here Thursday next in the packet boat, and hope to arrive in Richmond on Friday afternoon. I shall take with me as my companion Agnes, who has been my kind and uncomplaining nurse, and if we could only get down to you that evening, we would do so, for I want to see you, my sweet daughter and dear grandson. But as the doctors think it important that I should reach a Southern climate as soon as practicable, I fear I shall have to leave my visit to you till my return. I shall go first to Warrenton Springs, North Carolina, to visit the grave of my dear Annie, where I have always promised myself to go, and I think, if I am to accomplish it, I have no time to lose. I wish to witness her quiet sleep, with her dear hands crossed over her breast, as it were in mute prayer, undisturbed by her distance from us, and to feel that her pure spirit is waiting in bliss in the land of the blessed. From there, according to my feelings, I shall either go down to Norfolk or to Savannah, and take you, if practicable, on my return. I would ask you to come up to Richmond, but my movements are unknown to myself, as I cannot know the routes, schedules, etc., till I arrive there, but I have promised not to linger there longer than necessary, so I must avoid temptation. We are all as usual. Your mother still talks of visiting you, and when I urge her to make preparations for the journey, she replies, rather disdainfully, she has none to make. They have been made years ago. Custis and Mary are well, and Mildred writes that she will be back by April 1st. We are having beautiful weather now, which I hope may continue. From your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. To his daughter Mildred he writes again, giving her the minutest details as to the routes home. This is very characteristic of him. We were always fully instructed as to the best way to get to Lexington, and, indeed, all the roads of life were carefully marked out for us by him. Lexington, Virginia, March 23, 1870. My dear daughter, I wrote to you the other day telling you of my intention of going South, and of my general plan as far as formed. This morning your letter of the 21st arrived. I hope you will get back comfortably and safely, and if you can fall in with no escort, you had better go as far as Alexandria, the first stage of your journey. Aunt Maria, Cassius Lee, the Smiths, etc., would receive you. If you wish to come by Goshen, you must take the train from Alexandria on Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday, so as to reach us on any of those evenings when you will arrive here about 12 o'clock at night. By taking the train from Alexandria on the alternate days, Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, you will reach Staunton that evening by 4 p.m., remain all night, and come over by daylight the following day in the stage. By taking the train from Alexandria to Lynchburg Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays, you will reach there the same afternoon, about 4 p.m., then go immediately to the packet boat, and you will arrive here next morning. This last is the easiest route, and the best if you find no escort. Tell all the conductors and captains that you are my runaway daughter, and they will take care of you. I leave to-morrow evening on the packet boat. I told you that Agnes would accompany me. Tell my cousins Washington, Jane, and Mary that I wish I were going to see them. I should then anticipate some pleasure. But the doctors say I must turn my face the other way. I know they do not know everything, and yet I have often had to do what I was told without benefit to myself, and I shall have to do it again. Good-bye, my dear daughter. All unite in love. Your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, The Southern Trip. Letters to Mrs. Lee from Richmond and Savannah. From Brandon. Agnes Lee's account of her father's greetings from old friends and old soldiers. Wilmington and Norfolk do him honor. Visits to Fitzhugh and Robert in their homes. It is to be regretted that so little was written by my father while on this trip. In the letters extant, he scarcely refers to his reception by the people at different points visited. His daughter Agnes tells more, and we can imagine how tenderly and joyfully he was greeted by his old soldiers, their wives, children, and friends. He was very unwilling to be made a hero anywhere, and most reluctant to show himself to the crowds assembled at every station along his route, pressing to catch sight of him. "Why should they care to see me?" he would say, when urged to appear on the platform of the train. "I am only a poor old Confederate." This feeling, natural to him, was probably intensified at that time by the state of his health. On Sunday he writes to my mother of his trip to Richmond and of his stay there. Richmond, Virginia, March 29, 1870. My dear Mary: I reached here Friday afternoon and had a more comfortable journey than I expected. The night aboard the packet was very trying, but I survived it, and the dust of the railroad the following day. Yesterday the doctors, Houston, McGraw, and Cunningham, examined me for 2 hours, and I believe contemplate returning today. They say they will make up their opinion and communicate it to Dr. Barton, who will write me what to do. In the meantime, they desire me to continue his prescriptions. I think I feel better than when I left Lexington, certainly stronger, but am a little feverish. Whether it is produced by the journey or the toddies that Agnes administers, I do not know. I have not been able to see anybody, nor was I able to get the groceries yesterday. Agnes thinks you will have enough to last till I get back here, when I will select them and send them up. Should you want any particular article, write to Messrs. Bacon and Lewis for it. I saw yesterday morning Mr. John Stewart and Miss Mary, Miss Mary Stewart of Brook Hill, afterward Mrs. Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina, who had called to see Agnes, but found she was out. Miss Mary looked very sweet and inquired about you all. Agnes rode out there yesterday afternoon and saw all the family. I am told all our friends here are well. Many of my Northern friends have done me the honor to call on me. Among them Brick Pomeroy. They like to see all that is going on. Agnes has gone to church with Colonel Corley. I was afraid to go. The day is unfavorable, and I should see so many of my old friends, to whom I would like to speak, that it might be injurious to me. I was in hopes that Fitzhugh might make his appearance yesterday, when we should have learned all about those below, but he did not. I hear that they are all well, however. I expect to continue our journey to morrow if nothing prevents, though I have not yet got the information I desire about the routes. Still, I will get on. I will leave to Agnes to tell you about herself. Love to all, truly, R. E. Lee. The next letter that I find is written from Savannah. Savannah, Georgia, April 2, 1870. My dear Mary: I reached here yesterday evening, and have borne the journey much better than I expected. I think I am stronger than when I left Lexington, but otherwise can discover no difference. I have had a tedious journey upon the whole, and have more than ever regretted that I undertook it. However, I have enjoyed meeting many friends, and the old soldiers have greeted me very cordially. My visit to dear Annie's grave was mournful, yet soothing to my feelings, and I was glad to have the opportunity of thanking the kind friends for their care of her while living, and their attention to her since her death. I saw most of the ladies of the committee who undertook the preparation of the monument and the inclosure of the cemetery, and was very kindly received by all the citizens of Warrenton, and, indeed, at all the towns through which we passed. Yesterday several gentlemen from Savannah met the train in which we came from Augusta — General Lawton, Mr. Andrew Lowe, Mr. Hodgson, etc., etc. I found they had arranged among themselves about my sojourn, so I yielded at once, and after depositing Agnes at General Lawton's, I came off to Mr. Lowe's, where I am now domiciled. His house is partially dismantled, and he is keeping house alone, so I have a very quiet time. This morning I took a short drive around the city with Agnes and Miss Lawton, and on returning called on Mrs. Elliott, who has her 2 widowed daughters living with her, Mrs. Elliott and Mrs. Habersham. I also went to see Mrs. Gordon, Mrs. Gilmer, and Mrs. Owens, and then returned to the Lowes, where I find he has invited some gentlemen to meet me at dinner — General Joe Johnston, General Lawton, General Gilmer, Colonel Corley, etc. Colonel Corley has stuck to me all the journey, and now talks of going to New Orleans. The weather to day is rather cool and raw, with an easterly wind, and if it continues I will go on to Florida next week. The woods are filled with flowers, yellow jasmine covering all the trees, etc., and fresh vegetables everywhere. I must leave Agnes to give you all details. The writing desk is placed in a dark corner in this handsome house, prepared for younger eyes than mine, and I can hardly see what I write. All friends inquire after you — Custis, Mary, and Mildred. Give my love to all, and believe me most truly, R. E. Lee. Mrs. R. E. Lee. The Colonel Corley mentioned in the above letters had been on General Lee's staff as chief quartermaster from the time he assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia until the surrender. His voluntary service as escort on this trip, so delicately offered and performed, was highly appreciated by his old commander. A letter from his daughter to her mother, written the next day, tells many particulars of their journey, but still leaves much to be desired. Savannah, Georgia, April 3, 1870. I hardly know where to commence. I have so little time to write. We left Richmond Monday, 2 p.m. We reached Warrenton at 10 o'clock, and were taken to their house by Mr. and Mrs. White, who met us at the depot. The next morning papa and I drove with Captain White's horses to the cemetery. Mrs. White gave me a quantity of beautiful white hyacinths, which she said were for you, too, and I had brought some gray moss that Kitty Stiles had given me. This I twined on the base of the monument. The flowers looked very pure and beautiful. The place is just as it is in Mr. Hope's picture, which I have. It was a great satisfaction to be there again. We did not go to the springs a mile off. Returning, we stopped at Mr. Joe Jones, old Mr. J.'s son. They insisted on our taking dinner. He has 11 children, I think, and there were numberless others there. They loaded me with flowers, the gardens full of hyacinths and early spring flowers. Mrs. Jones is a very nice lady, one of those who were foremost in erecting the monument. We then stopped at the farm of the Joneses, who were at the Springs when we were there in the autumn of 1862, and Mrs. J. knew me at once and asked affectionately after you. Saw Patty and Emma, all the daughters married except Patty and the youngest. Mr. J. is very infirm, 83 years old. That evening a number of persons came to see us, Mrs. Alston and Mrs. Brownlow, 2 others of the committee of ladies. Every one was very kind. Indeed, I wish you could travel with papa to see the affection and feeling shown toward him everywhere. We spent that night in the sleeping car, very handsome and comfortable, but the novelty, I suppose, made us wakeful. At Raleigh and another place, the people crowded to the depot and called, "Lee! Lee!" and cheered vociferously, but we were locked up and mum. Everywhere along the road where meals were provided, the landlords invited us in, and when we would not get out, sent coffee and lunches. Even soldiers on the train sent in fruit, and I think we were expected to die of eating. At Charlotte and Salisbury there were other crowds and bands. Colonel Corley joined us at C, having asked to go to Savannah with us. The train stopped 15 minutes at Columbia. Colonel Alexander Haskell took charge of the crowd, which, in spite of the pouring rain, stood there till we left. General E. Porter Alexander was there, and was very hearty in his inquiries after all of us. His little girl was lifted into the car. Namesakes appeared on the way of all sizes. Old ladies stretched their heads into the windows at way stations, and then drew back and said, "He is mightily like his pictures." We reached Augusta Wednesday night. The mayor and council met us, having heard a few minutes before that papa was on the train. We were whirled off to the hotel, and papa decided to spend Thursday there. They had a reception the whole of the morning. Crowds came. Wounded soldiers, servants, and working men even. The sweetest little children, namesakes, dressed to their eyes, with bouquets of japonica, or tiny cards in their fat little hands, with their names. Robert Burwell, of Clark, who married Miss Clayton there, Randall, author of My Maryland, General McLaws, Wright, Gardner, and many others. Saw the Misses Boggs, General B.'s sisters. Miss Rebecca knew Mrs. Kirkpatrick very well, and asked after her. Miss Russell, with whose father and sisters we had been at the White Sulphur, helped us to receive. She is very tall and handsome, and was superb in a white lace shawl, a moire antique with a train. The Branch brothers rather took possession of me. Melville, who was at the Institute, Virginia Military Institute, Lexington, Virginia, and knew the Letchers very well, drove me in and around the town, at the rate of a mile a minute. Another brother took me to the skating rink at night, a serenade that night. At some point on the way here, Generals Lawton and Gilmore, Mr. Andrew Lowe, and others got on the cars with us. Flowers were given us at various places. I so much enjoyed the evidences of spring all along our route, more and more advanced as we proceeded. The jasmine, though passing away, was still in sufficient abundance in some places to perfume the air. The dark marshes were rich in tall magnolia trees, beautiful red buds, and other red blossoms I did not know. The jasmine and the trees hanging with gray moss, perfectly weird looking, have been the least luxuriant places in the interim. Savannah is green with live oaks, and filled with trees and shrubbery. I wish you could see a large marble table in the parlor, where I am writing, with a pyramid of jasmine in the center, and 4 large plates full at the corners, almost covering the square, all sent me Saturday. The Lawtons are as kind as possible, wanted papa to stay here, but Mr. Andrew Lowe had arranged to take him to his house at bedtime. So he lost the benefit of a serenade from 2 bands, alternating, which we enjoyed, General Lawton telling the crowd General Lee had retired from fatigue. Papa has borne the journey and the crowds far better than I thought he would, and seems stronger. Monday. It seems impossible to finish this. I enclose some scraps which will tell our story. Crowds of persons have been coming to see me ever since I came. Saw Mrs. General Johnston, Nannie Hutchison, of course, and Reverend and Mrs. Moore yesterday. They left today. Colonel Corley has taken Corrine, and me on a beautiful drive this morning to Bonaventure, which is to be a cemetery, and to several places in its vicinity. I never saw anything more impressive and beautiful than the avenues of live oaks, literally covered with long gray moss, arching over the roads. Tell Messrs. Owens and the Minnies I have seen their families, who are very kind to us. General and Mrs. Gilmer ask especially after Custis. We think of going to Florida in a few days. Haven't heard from you. Agnes. This is the only letter from his daughter Agnes written at this time that can be found. My father, in his letters to his family, left details and particulars for her to describe, and doubtless she did so. Unfortunately, there is but this single letter. On April 17th, he writes again from Savannah to my mother, "My dear Mary, I have received your letter of the Wednesday after our departure, and am glad to hear that you are well and getting on so comfortably. The destruction of the bridge is really a loss to the community, and I fear will inconvenience Mildred in her return. However, the spring is now advancing, and they ought to be able to get up the new bridge. I hope I am a little better. I seem to be stronger and to walk with less difficulty, but it may be owing to the better streets of Savannah. I presume if any change takes place it will be gradual and slow. Please say to Dr. Barton that I have received his letter, and am obliged to him for his kind advice. I shall begin to-day with his new prescriptions, and will follow them strictly. To-morrow I expect to go to Florida, and will stop first at Amelia Island. The visitors to that region are coming out, saying the weather is uncomfortably hot. If I find it so, I shall return. Savannah has become very pleasant within the last few days, and I dare say I shall do as well here as elsewhere. The spring, however, is backward. I believe I told you that I was staying with Mr. Andrew Lowe, who is very kind, and where I am very comfortable. I am going to be separated from Agnes, and have received invitations from several of the inhabitants where we could be united, but it is awkward to change. Agnes has been sick, too, since her arrival, which has made me the more anxious to be with her. You know she is like her papa, always wanting something. She is, however, better to-day, as I learn, though I have not seen her yet. I saw her twice yesterday. She was better then, and came down to Mrs. Lawton's room, so I hope she will be well enough to go with me to Amelia Island. The Messrs. Mackay got down from Etowah last evening, both looking very well, and have reopened their old house in Broughton Street, which I am glad of. I have seen Mrs. Dr. Elliott and family, the Andersons, Gordons, etc., etc., and all my former acquaintances, and many new ones. I do not think travelling in this way procures me much quiet and repose. I wish I were back. Give my love to her, his daughter Mary, and to Custis, and tell the latter I hope he will be able to keep Sam in the seeds he may require. Praying a merciful God to guard and direct you all, I am most affectionately, R. E. Lee. P.S. I received a letter from F. All well, R. E. L. Sam was the gardener and man of all work at Lexington. My father took great interest in his garden and always had a fine one. Still, in Savannah, he again writes to his wife, acknowledging the letters forwarded to him and commenting on the steps being taken. Savannah, Georgia, April 11, 1870. My dear Mary, I received yesterday your letters of the 3d and 6th, enclosing Reverend Mr. Brantley's and daughters and Cousin Cassius. I forwarded the petition to the President, accompanying the letter to Cassius, and asked him to give it to Mr. Smith. Hearing, while passing through Richmond, of the decision of the Supreme Court referred to, I sent word to Mr. Smith that if he thought the time and occasion propitious for taking steps for the recovery of Arlington, the mill, etc., to do so, but to act quietly and discreetly. I presume the petition sent you for signature was the consequence. I do not know whether this is a propitious time or not, and should rather have had an opportunity to consult friends, but am unable to do so. Tell Custis that I wish that he would act for me, through you or others, for it is mainly on his account that I desire the restitution of the property. I see that a resolution has been introduced into Congress to perfect the title of the government to Arlington and other national cemeteries, which I have been apprehensive of stirring, so I suppose the matter will come up anyway. I did not sign the petition, for I did not think it necessary, and believe the more I was kept out of sight, the better. We must hope for the best, speak as little, and act as discreetly as possible. The Reverend Dr. Brantley has invited us by the faculty of this college to deliver the baccalaureate sermon next June, and I invite him and his daughter, in the event of his accepting, to stay with us. Do you know whether he has accepted? I should have gone to Florida last Friday as proposed, but Agnes was not well enough. She took cold on the journey, or on her first arrival, and has been quite sick, but is better now. I have not seen her this morning, but if she is sufficiently recovered, we will leave here to morrow. I have received a message saying that she was much better. As regards myself, my general health is pretty good. I feel stronger than when I came. The warm weather has also dispelled some of the rheumatic pains in my back, but I perceive no change in the stricture in my chest. If I attempt to walk beyond a very slow gait, the pain is always there. It is all true what the doctors say about its being aggravated by any fresh cold, but how to avoid taking cold is the question. It seems with me to be impossible. Everything and anything seems to give me one. I meet with much kindness and consideration, but fear that nothing will relieve my complaint, which is fixed and old. I must bear it. I hope that you will not give over your trip to the White House if you still desire to make it. I will commence my return upon the last of April, stopping at some points, and will be a few days in Richmond and the White House if able. I must leave to Agnes all details. Give much love to Custis, Mary, and Mildred. Tell the latter I have received her letters. Remember me to all friends. Most sincerely yours, R. E. Lee. Mrs. R. E. Lee. After visiting Cumberland Island, and going up the St. Johns River as far as Palatka, and spending the night at Colonel Cole's place near there, they returned to Savannah. Colonel Cole was on General Lee's staff as chief commissary during the time he commanded the Army of Northern Virginia, and was a very dear friend of us all. Savannah, Georgia, April 18, 1870. My dear Mary: I have received your letter of the 13th, and am glad to learn that you propose visiting the White House, as I feared my journey might prevent you. I am, however, very anxious on the subject, as I apprehend the trip will be irksome and may produce great inconvenience and pain. I hope you received my letter of the 11th, written just before my departure for Florida. In case you did not, I will state that I forwarded your petition to Cassius Lee as received, not thinking my signature necessary or advantageous. I will send the money received from the University Publishing Company to Carter, for whom I intend it. This was the money that came to General Lee from his new edition of his father's Memoirs of the War in the Southern Department of the United States. I returned from Florida Saturday, 16th, having had a very pleasant trip as far as Palatka on the St. Johns. We visited Cumberland Island, and Agnes decorated my father's grave with beautiful fresh flowers. I presume it is the last time I shall be able to pay to it my tribute of respect. The cemetery is unharmed, and the grave is in good order, though the house of Dungeness has been burned and the island devastated. Mr. Nightingale, the present proprietor, accompanied me from Brunswick. Mr. Andrew Lowe was so kind as to go with us the whole way, thinking Agnes and I were unable to take care of ourselves. Agnes seemed to enjoy the trip very much, and has improved in health. I shall leave to her all details. We spent a night at Colonel Cole's, a beautiful place near Palatka, and ate oranges from the trees. We passed some other beautiful places on the river, but could not stop at any but Jacksonville, where we remained from 4 p.m. to 3 a.m. next morning, rode over the town, etc., and were hospitably entertained by Colonel Sanderson. The climate was delightful, the fish inviting and abundant. We have returned to our old quarters, Agnes to the Lawtons and I to Lowes. We shall remain here this week, and will probably spend a few days in Charleston and Norfolk, if we go that way, and at Brandon and Shirley before going to the White House, where we shall hope to meet you. I know of no certain place where a letter will catch me before I reach Richmond, where the doctors desire me to spend a few days that they may again examine me. Write me there whether Fitzhugh is too full to receive us. It will depend upon my feelings, whether, etc., whether I make the digression by Norfolk. Poor little Agnes has had, I fear, but little enjoyment so far, and I wish her to have all the pleasure she can gather on the route. She is still weak, and seems to suffer constantly from the neuralgia. I hope I am better. I know that I am stronger, but I still have the pain in my chest whenever I walk. I have felt it also occasionally of late, when quiescent, but not badly, which is new. To-day, Doctors Arnold and Reed, of this city, examined me for about an hour. They concur in the opinion of the other physicians, and think it pretty certain that my trouble arises from some adhesion of the parts, not from any injury of the lungs and heart, but that the pericardium may not be implicated, and the adhesion may be between the pleura and I have forgotten the name. Their visit was at the urgent entreaty of friends, which I could not well resist, and perhaps their opinion is not fully matured. I am continuing the prescriptions of Drs. Barton and Madison. My rheumatic pains, either from the effects of the medicine or the climate, or both, have diminished, but the pain along the breastbone ever returns on my making any exertion. I am glad Mildred has returned as well. I hope that she will continue so. After perusal, send this letter to one of the children to whom you may be writing, that Drs. Barton, etc., may be informed how I am getting along, as I have been unable to write to them or to any one at Lexington. I have so many letters to write in answer to kind invitations, etc., and so many interruptions, that my time is consumed. Besides, writing is irksome to me. Give my love to Fitzhugh, Tab, and Robert, and to Custis, Mary, and Mildred, when you write. Agnes said she was going out to return some of her numerous visits to-day, and I presume will not be able to write. She has had but little comfort in her clothes. Her silk dress was spoiled on the way, and she returned it to Baltimore, but has learned that they can do nothing with it, so she will have to do without it, which I presume she can do. I hope you may reach the White House comfortably. I will apprise you of my movements from time to time. I hope my godson will know you. Tell him I have numbers of his namesakes since I left Virginia, and of whom I was not aware. I hope they will come to good. With great affection, R. E. Lee. Mrs. R. E. Lee. From the following letters, all that I can find relating to this part of the journey, it appears that the travelers started for Virginia, stopping at Charleston, Wilmington, and Norfolk. Of their visit to Charleston I can find no record. He and Agnes stayed at the beautiful home of Mr. Bennett, who had 2 sons at the college, and a lovely daughter, Mary Bennett. I remember Agnes telling me of the beautiful flowers and other attentions lavished upon them. At Wilmington they spent a day with Mr. and Mrs. Davis. His coming there was known only to a few persons, as its announcement was by a private telegram from Savannah, but quite a number of ladies and gentlemen secured a small train and went out on the Southern road to meet him. When they met the regular passenger train from Savannah, General Lee was taken from it to the private one and welcomed by his many friends. He seemed bright and cheerful, and conversed with all. He spoke of his health not being good, and on this account begged that there would be no public demonstration on his arrival, nor during his stay at Wilmington. On reaching that place, he accompanied Mr. George Davis to his house, Attorney General in Mr. Davis's cabinet, and was his guest during his sojourn in the city. Mrs. Davis was a Miss Fairfax, daughter of Dr. O. Fairfax, of Alexandria, Virginia. They had been and were very old and dear friends and neighbors. The next morning my father walked out and called on Bishop Atkinson, with whom he had been well acquainted when they both lived in Baltimore some 12 years before, the one as rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church, the other as captain of United States Engineers in charge of the harbor defenses of the city. There was a dinner given to my father that day at Mr. Davis's home, and a number of gentlemen were present. He was looking very well, but in conversation said that he realized there was some trouble with his heart, which he was satisfied was incurable. The next day, May 1st, he left for Norfolk, Virginia, where Dr. and Mrs. Selden were the kind entertainers of his daughter and himself. Agnes told me that in going and returning from church, the street was lined with people who stood, hats off, in silent deference. From Norfolk they visited Lower and Upper Brandon, on the James River, the homes of the Harrisons, then Shirley, higher up the river. Then they proceeded by way of Richmond to the White House. My mother having arrived there from Lexington a short time previously, the General wrote from Brandon to his wife: "Brandon, May 7, 1870. My dear Mary, we have reached this point on our journey. Mrs. Harrison and Miss Belle are well and very kind, and I have been up to see Mr. William Harrison and Mr. George and their families. The former is much better than I expected to find him, and I hope will recover his health as the spring advances. The ladies are all well, and Miss Gooley is very handsome. Agnes and I went over to see Warrenton Carter and his wife this morning. They are both very well, and everything around them looks comfortable and flourishing. They have a nice home, and as far as I could see, everything is prospering. Their little boy was asleep, but we were invited in to see him. He is a true Carter. Mrs. Page, the daughter of General Richardson, is here on a visit, and Mrs. Murdock, wife of their former pastor, arrived this morning. We are to go up to Mr. George Harrison's this evening, where the children are to have some tableau, and where we are expected to spend the evening. In Norfolk we saw all our friends, but I did not succeed in getting out to Richard Page's as I desired, on account of the heavy rain on the appointed day, and engagements that interfered on others. Agnes and Mrs. Selden rode out, however, and saw all the family. Everybody inquired kindly after you, down to Bryan, and all sent their love. Brandon is looking very beautiful, and it is refreshing to look at the river. The garden is filled with flowers and abounds in roses. The yellow jasmine is still in bloom and perfumes the atmosphere. I have not heard from you or from Lexington since I left Savannah. I hope all are well. I am better, I trust. Am getting fat and big, but am still rigid and painful in my back. On Tuesday night I expect to go to Shirley, and on Thursday, 12th instant, to Richmond, and on Friday to the White House, unless I hear that you are crowded, in which case I will submit myself to the doctors for 2 or 3 days, as they desire, and then go down. Agnes now says she will accompany me to the White House, so that I shall necessarily pass through Richmond, as our baggage renders that route necessary. Therefore, unless something unforeseen prevents, I shall be with you on Friday next. All unite in love. Agnes, I hope, is better than when she left Lexington, but is not strong. You must give a great deal of love to Fitzhugh, Tab, my grandson Robert, and all with you. Most truly and affectionately, R. E. Lee. P.S. Monday. Your note of the 6th with Colonel Allen's letter has just been received. I am very sorry to hear of Tab's sickness. I hope that she will be well by the time of my arrival. I shall be glad to see Marky. R. E. Lee, Mrs. R. E. Lee. On the same date he writes to his daughter Mildred at Lexington: "Brandon, May 7, 1870. My dear daughter. Miss Jenny is putting up her mail and says that my letter must go with it, so I have but a few minutes to inform you that we have reached this point on our way home. We stayed a day in Wilmington with the Davises after leaving Charleston, and several with the Seldens in Norfolk, and shall on Tuesday next go up to Shirley, and then to the White House. Agnes threatens to abandon me at Shirley, and I wish that you were there to take her place. I am better, I hope, certainly am stronger, and have less pain, but am far from comfortable, and have little ability to move or do anything, though am growing large and fat. Perhaps that is the cause. All here are well and send love. Miss Belle very sweet, all very kind. I rode yesterday to the other Brandons and saw all the inhabitants. Captain Shirley spent the day here. Mr. William Harrison much better, and Miss Gooley very pretty. They have some visitors. It is quiet and delightful here, the river beautiful. Agnes will write when she finds time, which is a scarce commodity with her. I had intended to write before breakfast the longest portion of the day, but walked out and forgot it. We have little time before breakfast. Give much love to Mary and Custis. I hope that you are all well and comfortable. I was very glad to receive your letter the morning I left Savannah, and I hope that Mrs. Smith and Traveller are enjoying themselves. I hope to get back to Lexington about the 24th, but will write. After paying my visit to the White House, I will have to spend some days in Richmond at the doctor's request, as they wish to examine me again and more thoroughly. I hope all are well at the college. Remember me to all there and in Lexington. With affectionate love, your father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. The White House, my brother's home at that time, is on the Pamunkey River, about 25 miles north of Shirley. From my father's letter, it is evident he had thought of driving over, instead of going by boat and rail through Richmond. This plan was abandoned when his daughter determined to accompany him, as a lady's baggage, even in those days, was too voluminous for private conveyance. Mr. William Harrison lived at Upper Brandon, and Mr. George Harrison at Middle Brandon. The mistress of Lower Brandon, the old historic home, was Mrs. Isabella Ritchie Harrison, widow of the late George Harrison. Miss Jenny, referred to in the above letter, was Miss Virginia Ritchie, sister of Mrs. Harrison. She had succeeded in having a post office established at Lower Brandon, and herself made postmistress. This was done for the convenience of the Brandons and the immediate neighbourhood. The proceeds Miss Jenny gave to the Brandon Church. Of his visit to Shirley, his mother's home when she was a girl, and where she was married to Light Horse Harry, I can find no account written at the time. It is a few hours from Brandon to Shirley by steamer on the beautiful James, and they arrived there Tuesday, May 10th, and left the following Thursday by steamer for Richmond. So says the Home Journal, kept at Shirley. All the country came to see him, and there was a large party to dinner. One of the daughters of the house, then a young girl, says, "I can only remember the great dignity and kindness of General Lee's bearing, how lovely he was to all of us girls, that he gave us his photographs and wrote his name on them. He liked to have us tickle his hands, but when Cousin Agnes came to sit by him, that seemed to be her privilege. We regarded him with the greatest veneration. We had heard of God, but here was General Lee." My mother was now at the White House. I will here introduce portions of a letter of the 9th and 13th of May from her to her daughter in Lexington, telling of my father's arrival on the 12th. White House, May 9, 1870. Fitzhugh took us on a delightful drive this morning, dear Mildred, to Tunstall's, where we got your letter, and Marky got 9, including yours, so we were much gratified with our excursion. The road was fine, with the exception of a few mud holes, and the woods lovely with wild flowers and dogwood blossoms, and with all the fragrance of early spring, the dark holly and pine intermingling with the delicate leaves just brought out by the genial season, daisies, wild violets, and heart's ease. I have not seen so many wildflowers since I left Arlington. 13th. I determined after commencing this to wait and see your papa, who arrived last evening with Agnes. He looks fatter, but I do not like his complexion, and he seems still stiff. I have not yet had time to hear much of their tour, except a grand dinner given them at Mr. Bennett's. Your papa sends his love, and says he will be in Lexington somewhere about the 24th. There is no news. The country becomes more lovely each day. The locust trees are in full bloom, and the paulownia, the only tree left of all that were planted by poor Charlotte and myself. How all our labours have come to naught. The General has just come in. Robbie is writing on his knee, sitting as grave as a judge. He says now Marquis, Agnes, and many other words, and calls me bonne maman. We expect Rob this morning. Yours affectionately, M. C. Lee. At this time my father was persuaded to make me a visit. He had been invited before, when at different times he had been to the White House, but something had hitherto always prevented his coming. Now he decided to come. My Romancoke farm was situated in King William County, on the opposite side of the Pamunkey River, and some 15 miles east of White House. We arrived there in the afternoon, having come down by the steamer, which at that time ran from White House to Baltimore. Romancoke had been always a dependency of the White House, and was managed by an overseer who was subordinate to the manager on the latter estate. There was on it only a small house, of the size usual in our country for that character of property. I had taken possession in 1866, and was preparing to build a more comfortable residence, but in the meantime I lived in the house which had been occupied by the different overseers for above 75 years. Its accommodations were very limited, simple, and it was much out of repair. Owing to the settling of the underpinning in the centre, it had assumed a sway-back outline, which gave it the name of the Broken-Back House. No repairs had been attempted, as I was preparing to build a new home. My father, always dignified and self-contained, rarely gave any evidence of being astonished or startled. His self-control was great, and his emotions were not on the surface, but when he entered and looked around my bachelor quarters, he appeared really much shocked. As I was much better off in the matter of housekeeping than I had been for 4 years, I flattered myself that I was doing very well. I can appreciate fully now what he must have felt at the time. However, he soon rallied and concealed his dismay by making kindly fun of my surroundings. The next day at dinner he felt obliged to remark on my china, knives, and forks, and suggested that I might at least better my holdings in that line. When he got back to Richmond, he sent me a full set of plated forks and spoons, which I have been using from that day to this. He walked and drove over the farm, discussed my plans for improvements, and was much interested in all my work, advising me about the site of my new house, new barns, ice house, etc. He evidently enjoyed his visit, for the quiet and rest were very refreshing. About 30 miles as the crow flies from my place down York River is situated in Gloucester County, White Marsh, an old Virginia home which then belonged to Dr. Prosser Tabb, who, with his wife and children, was living there. Mrs. Tabb was a near cousin of my father, and as a little girl had been a pet and a favorite. His affection and regard for her had lasted from his early manhood. He had seen but little of her since the war, and when Cousin Rebecca, as we all called her, learned he was to be at the White House, she wrote begging him to pay her a visit. This he had agreed to do if it was possible. While at the White House we had consulted together as to the best method of accomplishing this trip, and we determined to make it from Romancoke. So I drove him to West Point, and there got aboard the Baltimore steamer, taking my horse and trap with us. At Cappahoosic, a wharf on the York, we landed and drove the 9 miles to White Marsh, arriving at supper time, as we still say in Virginia, i.e., about 7:30 p.m. When General Lee got off on the wharf, so great was the desire of the passengers and crew to see him that they all went to the side of the boat, which caused her to list so that I was unable to get my horse out through the gangway until the captain had ordered every one to the other side. As the sun went down, it became chilly, and I drove quite rapidly, anxious to get my father out of the night air as soon as possible. He said nothing at the time, nor did I know that he noticed my unusual speed, but afterward he remarked on it to several persons, saying, "I think Rob drives unnecessarily fast." We were expected, and were met at the door by all the family and guests. A hearty welcome was given us. After supper he was the centre of the circle in the drawing-room, and made the acquaintance of the children of the house and of the friends and relatives of the family who were there. He said little, but all listened eagerly to what he did say, and were charmed with his pleasant smile and gracious manner. Cousin Rebecca introduced him to her son-in-law, Captain Perrin, mentioning that he had been wounded in the war, and was still lame from the effects. The General replied that at any rate he was all right now, for he had a pair of strong young feet to wait upon him, indicating his young wife. As was customary in this section of Virginia, the house was full of visitors, and I shared my father's room and bed. Though many a year had passed since we had been bedfellows, he told me that he remembered well the time when, as a little fellow, I had begged for the privilege. The next day he walked about the beautiful gardens, and was driven over the plantation, and shown the landscapes and water views of the immediate neighborhood. Mr. Graves, Dr. Tabb's overseer, who had the honor of being his coachman, fully appreciated it, and was delighted when my father praised his management. He had been a soldier under the General, and had stoutly carried his musket to Appomattox, where he surrendered it. When told of this by Dr. Tabb, my father took occasion to compliment him on his steadfast endurance and courage, but Graves simply and sincerely replied, "Yes, General, I stuck to the army, but if you had in your entire command a greater coward than I was, you ought to have had him shot." My father, who was greatly amused at his candor, spoke of it when he got back from his drive, saying, "That sort of a coward makes a good soldier." That the drive had fatigued him was quite apparent to Cousin Rebecca, who begged him to go and lie down to rest, but he declined, though finally, at her request, he consented to take a glass of wine. Mrs. Tabb was anxious to give a general reception that day in his honor, so that all the old soldiers in the country could have an opportunity of shaking hands with him, but at the General's request the idea was abandoned. Several persons were invited to meet him at dinner, among them the Reverend Mr. Phillips, an Englishman, the rector of Abingdon, an old colonial church in the county. He and his wife were ardent admirers of General Lee, and had often expressed a great desire to see him, so Mrs. Tabb kindly gave them this opportunity. They were charmed with him, and, writing to their friends in England, declared, "The greatest event in our lives has occurred. We have seen General Lee." One of his young cousins, in talking with him, wondered what fate was in store for us poor Virginians. The General replied, with an earnest, softened look, "You can work for Virginia, to build her up again, to make her great again. You can teach your children to love and cherish her." I was struck with the tenderness of his manner to all these cousins, many of whom he had never seen before, and the real affection and interest he manifested toward them. He seemed pleased and touched by their love and kindness. I think he enjoyed his visit, but it was plain that he was easily fatigued. To catch our steamer the next morning, an early start was necessary. Arrangements were made the night before, and all good byes said, for we had to leave the house about 5 o'clock. That night he was very restless and wakeful, and remarked that it was generally so with him whenever he had to get up at an unusual hour, as he was always uneasy lest he might be late. However, we got off in full time, made the connection with our steamer, and returned immediately to the White House. I left the steamer at West Point to take my father home, after which I joined him at the former place. After a short stay at the White House, he started for Lexington, stopping over in Richmond for a few days. From there he writes to his daughter Mildred in Lexington: "Richmond, Virginia, May 23, 1870. My precious daughter: I came up from the White House this morning with Agnes, but she threatens to divorce herself from me, and we have already separated. She is at Dr. Fairfax's, and I am at Mr. McFarland's. She promises, however, to see me occasionally, and if I can restore our travelling relations, even at costly sacrifice, I shall be happy to take her along with me. I find I shall be detained here too long to take the Wednesday's boat from Lynchburg, but if not prevented by circumstances now not foreseen, I shall take the Friday's boat, so as to reach Lexington Saturday morning, 28th instant. If Sam is well enough, and it should be otherwise convenient, he could meet me with Lucy and the carriage, or with Traveller. If not, I will get a seat up in the omnibus. Your mother proposes to leave in the boat for Bremo on the 1st Proximo, spend 1 week there, and then continue her journey to Lexington. Agnes has not yet made up her mind whether she will go with me, her mother, or remain for a while. I hope to find you well, though alone. I must reserve all accounts till we meet, which I am very anxious should take place as soon as practicable. I am improving, I think, in general health, but cannot tell certainly as to the difficulty in my chest, as I have been unable to test my progress. I had a pleasant visit to F. and Robert, and enjoyed rest there, which I wanted. Love to Custis, and kind regards to all friends. I hope that I shall find all well and doing well. All at the White House send love. Poor Tab is still sick. Marky Williams is with your mother. Robert came up with us, but returns this evening. I have seen Dr. Houston this morning, and I am to have a great medicine talk to morrow. Your devoted father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. End of Chapter 22.